The forest was quiet as the sun started to set, and a soft wind moved the tall grass like waves in the ocean, and birds flew low over the trees, making soft sounds in the distance while Jake walked slowly through the woods with his backpack on his shoulder and a stick in his hand to move away the bush on his path as he looked for wild berries and mushrooms to collect for dinner at his small cabin near the hill. He stopped when he heard a loud crash and saw a blue light flash through the trees, and he dropped his stick in surprise and ran toward the noise, without thinking much because it was not normal for such lights to appear in this peaceful place, and his heart beat fast as he got closer and the air felt warmer with every step. He reached a small open area where smoke was rising from a glowing pod that had made a hole in the ground, and the pod looked smooth and silver like metal, but it had strange symbols on its side that Jake had never seen before, and as he moved closer to the pod he felt a strange energy in the air, and then he heard a soft cry from inside the pod like a scared child. Whispering for help, he stepped back a little when the pod made a hiss sound and opened slowly with steam rising from its sides, and inside was something he could not believe at first because it was a small girl, with greenish-blue skin and glowing purple eyes and two tiny horns on her head, and she looked at Jake with wide eyes full of fear and wrapped her arms around her knees as if trying to disappear. Jake raised his hands to show he was not a threat and spoke gently to her, saying he was a friend and would not hurt her, and the tiny alien girl looked confused and afraid, and she tried to speak, but her voice was low and shaky as she said something in a strange language and then switched to a broken English, saying, "Please do not eat me, please. I just want to live." Jake was shocked by her words, and his face showed it as he replied, "No, I will not eat you. I am human, but I am not a monster, and I want to help you." And she looked at him unsure, and her small body shook with fear as she looked around the forest as if expecting more danger to come. He slowly took off his jacket and placed it on the ground and stepped back to give her space, and she crawled out of the pod with small, careful steps and looked at the jacket and then at Jake, and after a long pause she picked it up and wrapped it around herself because her own clothes were torn and her body was shivering from cold and fear. Jake pointed to the path behind him and said, "My home is not far. We can go there and you can rest and eat something, and I promise no one will hurt you there." And she hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly and followed him while looking around at the trees and birds as if seeing everything for the first time. They walked in silence for a while, and the sky turned darker and stars began to appear above them, and she looked up and gasped as if she had never seen stars this way. And Jake asked her name, and she said in a soft voice, "My name is Zira, and I was not supposed to come here, but they sent me because I failed my mission, and now I fear your kind will punish me." Jake looked at her and said again kindly, "I am not going to hurt you, Zira, and maybe we are not so scary after all." And she gave a small nod but did not speak again. As they walked until his cabin came into view, and she stopped in front of it and said softly, "This is your shelter. It is strange, but it smells nice and warm." Jake smiled and opened the door and said, "Come inside. It is safer here." And she stepped in, slowly looking at the walls and the wooden furniture and the fireplace that gave off a soft heat, and she touched the edge of the table and looked at a picture of Jake with his dog and asked, "What is this creature?" And Jake told her it was his pet and best friend who passed away last year, and she looked sad and whispered, "I never had a friend before." He gave her some bread and soup, and she sniffed it first, then took a small bite, and her eyes widened, and she said, "This is not poison, it is good. It is warm and it is soft." And she ate slowly while watching Jake, and he sat near the fire and asked her why she thought humans eat aliens, and she said, "In my world, that is what they told us. They said humans are wild and dangerous, and they take what they want." Jake laughed softly and said, "Maybe some humans are like that, but not me and not everyone." And Zira looked at him for a long time and then said, "Maybe I was wrong. Maybe you are different, but I still do not feel safe, and I do not know why I am here, but I think something else is coming, something bad, and I can feel it." Jake looked at her face and saw fear, but also a strange glow in her eyes, like she could see more than he could, and he knew in that moment her arrival was not just an accident, but something big was about to begin. Zira sat near the small wooden table and looked around the room with wide, curious eyes as the walls of Jake's cabin felt too close and the ceiling too low for her comfort. even though she was small and light as a feather, and every object inside seemed unfamiliar and strange like tools from another world, and she kept looking at the door as if ready to run in case something happened. Jake watched her carefully while stirring the soup on the stove and tried to keep the room calm and warm so she would not feel afraid, and he spoke in a soft voice, asking her if she was cold or hungry, and she nodded slowly and whispered that her bones felt like ice in her stomach, had not known food in many cycles, which meant she had been starving since long before her pod crash. He handed her a warm bowl of soup and a spoon, but she stared at both like they were traps and then placed the bowl on the floor and sniffed it with great care, and then touched the soup with her finger to see if it would burn or hurt, and finally she took one careful sip and froze for a moment before taking another sip, and then more until the bowl was empty, and she looked up at Jake and said in a small voice, "This is food made with care, not harm." Jake smiled and offered her a small cup of water, which she also tested, and then drank slowly and said, "Your water tastes like peace and not poison, and your air smells like dreams and not war." And Jake asked her gently why she thought humans would devour her, and she replied in a quiet voice that her people believed humans were beasts who consumed all things and destroyed without reason and cared for no one, not even their own. Jake shook his head and told her that maybe some humans were not kind, but many were, and he was one of them, and he had no reason to hurt her or fear her. And she looked at him again with unsure eyes and asked him if he was truly not afraid of her strange skin and eyes and small horns, and he said, "No, you look like someone who needs help, not someone to be feared." She wrapped the blanket tighter around her body and said in her world fear was taught from birth, and kindness was seen as weakness and failure. To win in battle meant punishment or exile, and she had failed to pass the tests of her people, and now she was sent away to prove her worth or be forgotten. And she added that her pod was meant to land far away from humans, but it had lost control in the atmosphere and brought her straight to him. Jake leaned back and listened without interrupting, and then said, "Maybe fate wanted us to meet, maybe you crashed near me for a reason, and maybe you are not meant to go back to fear and punishment, but to something new and strange like this cabin and this planet, where not everything wants to hurt you." Zira looked down at her hands and touched the glowing mark on her wrist, which pulsed gently with blue light, and said, "This mark is my bond to the council. They can see my thoughts and track my steps, and if I stay here too long, they will come and bring judgment. And maybe worse." And Jake asked what happens if they find you with a human, and she said, "They will call me weak and dirty and unworthy, and they will erase me from memory, like I never lived." The fire crackled in the corner, and Zira's eyes watched the flames with deep thought as she whispered that she had never felt warm like this before, not just in body but in soul, and that scared her more than the council, because warmth could melt walls built by fear, and love could grow where only duty was planted. Jake stood up and placed a soft pillow and extra blanket near the fire and told her she could sleep there safely and no one would come in the night, and he would stay awake for a while in case she needed anything. And she looked at him again and said in a voice filled with wonder, "You are so strange, and yet I do not wish to leave this place just yet." As the night grew deeper, Zira lay down near the fire and her eyes began to close slowly, but her mind stayed awake with thoughts of her world and her mission and her mistake and this human who had shown her more care in one evening than anyone else in her life. And she felt a small tear slide down her cheek, and she let it fall without shame. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and something unseen moved in the darkness, something that had been following the crash trail from the sky and now watched from afar with glowing red eyes and soft clicking sounds, as if recording everything it saw and waiting for the perfect time to move closer inside the cabin. Zira's breath grew steady and calm, and Jake sat by the window with a tool in his hand just in case, and a question in his heart that had no answer yet, and both of them knew in their own way that this was only the beginning of something bigger than them, and the forest would not stay quiet for long. Shall I continue with part 3 next in the same style and format? Morning light touched the windows as soft golden rays crept into the small cabin, where Zira opened her eyes slowly and felt the warmth of the fire still near her, and for a brief moment she forgot she was on a strange planet in a stranger home, and everything felt calm and silent like a forgotten dream. And then she remembered everything and sat up with a sharp breath as her fingers moved to the glowing mark on her wrist, which now pulsed a little faster than before. Jake was already outside, chopping wood with slow and steady swings, and sweat rolled down his neck as he worked without making noise so Zira could rest. And when she stepped out into the soft sunlight wrapped in a blanket, he looked up and smiled and waved, and she tilted her head slightly like a curious bird trying to understand his actions. He handed her a slice of bread and pointed toward a log so she could sit and eat. And though she said nothing, she took the bread and sat beside him, watching as he worked, and wondered how someone so strong could be so gentle and not like the stories told back on her homeworld, where humans were shown as destroyers of peace and harvesters of life. Suddenly the sky above them shifted as clouds moved fast and dark shadows passed overhead, and Zira stood quickly, her eyes locked on the sky as if she sensed something beyond what humans could see, and she said in a quiet voice, "They are searching for me, and their machines fly through space like ghosts following signals. And I should not be here because they will come." Jake tried to calm her and said, "Maybe they cannot find you, and maybe Earth is too far or too strange for them." But Zira shook her head and said, "The mark sends weak pulses even now, and if they focus hard enough they will see me, and if they send a hunter drone then I will not survive long because I am still weak and broken." Just then a rustle in the trees made them both turn, and Jake picked up his axe ready to defend, and Zira stepped back, her hands raised slightly and her eyes wide with fear, as a small deer stepped out from behind the trees and looked at them both before walking away slowly without fear. And Jake laughed, but Zira did not, and instead she looked at her own fingers and whispered something in her own language. Later, as they sat inside, Jake handed her an old human book and said, "Maybe this can help you learn more words and understand this world." And she took the book and turned its pages, gently feeling the texture of paper like something sacred, and said softly in her broken English, "Your world has so many things I never touched before, and it feels almost unreal." As she read, her glowing mark pulsed brighter, and Jake noticed her fingers starting to spark with blue light, and he stood in shock as the light danced around her hands like living stars. And Zira gasped and dropped the book and said, "No, this should not happen, not now and not here." And Jake asked, "What is it? What is going on?" And Zira held her hands tight and said, "This only happens when our emotions run too deep, and I have not felt so much in years." Her body shook as more light built up around her, and the cabin lights flickered and the fire flared and then dimmed, and Jake reached out without fear and placed his hand on hers, and the light stopped like it had been caught and held in a gentle cage. And Zira looked at him with wonder in her eyes and said, "Your touch, it calms the storm." And I do not know why. Jake said, "Maybe we are more connected than we think, and maybe your power is not a danger but a gift." And Zira looked down and whispered, "We are taught to hide it or be punished, and power like this belongs only to the elite and not to failures like me. But now it has awakened, and I cannot go back even if I wanted." Outside, the wind had changed, and somewhere deep in the sky something had taken notice, and a silent signal had been sent back to her world, and a blinking red eye opened in space, watching and recording and planning. And a hunter drone had started to move back inside. Jake said, "You do not have to hide anymore, and you do not have to be afraid because you are not alone." And Zira looked at him and felt something heavy in her chest lift, just a little, like a door opening to something new and unknown. And she said, "Maybe I crashed here, not by mistake, but because I was meant to learn what freedom feels like." She touched her own chest where the light had grown warm and said, "Maybe this planet has rules I do not yet understand, but I think I want to learn them, and maybe I want to feel more, not less. And if the council comes, I will not run this time." Jake looked at her and said, "If they come, then we face them together, and I will not let them take you without a fight." And Zira smiled for the first time, not with fear or sadness, but with a spark of courage, and said, "Then let the stars watch us, because I will not bow anymore." The night came quietly as the sky turned into a deep sea of black, with thousands of stars shining like small eyes watching from far away, and the forest whispered with soft waves brushing against the trees, while Jake sat outside sharpening a tool, and Zira stared up at the stars with her arms wrapped around her knees and her glowing mark pulsing gently like a slow heartbeat. She said nothing for a long time, and Jake did not ask her to speak because he knew she was thinking of things beyond his understanding, and maybe of places she had left behind, or the people who had sent her here without care or kindness, and as the fire crackled between them, a soft humming sound started from the woods. Jake stood slowly and picked up the sharpened stick, and Zira stood too and looked toward the trees where the sound came from, and she said, "That sound is not from your world," and her eyes glowed faintly as she stepped forward, and the mark on her wrist became brighter with each step, as if it was reacting to something near. From the shadows came a floating orb no bigger than an apple with silver wings and a red center that blinked slowly, and Zira stepped in front of Jake and raised her hands as the orb hovered near and began to speak in a language filled with static and broken signals, and Zira replied in the same language, though her voice trembled. Jake stood confused but silent as Zira listened closely and then turned to him with a face that had lost all color, and she said, "It is a scout messenger from my planet, and it says I have 7 rotations before Judgment arrives, and if I do not return or show proof of change, they will send enforcers to erase me and possibly the threat I may pose." Jake asked, "What does that mean?" And Zira replied, "It means they believe I may have shared knowledge or awakened powers that must remain hidden, and if they decide I am corrupted by this world, they will destroy everything in the area to hide their mistake. And I'm now classified as a risk." She sat down on the log and buried her face in her hands and said, "I never wanted this. I only wanted to escape their punishment, not bring danger to your world, and now even the trees may burn because I found a reason to feel safe." Jake placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "You are not alone anymore, and we will find a way to stop this." And he picked up the orb and looked at it and said, "Can you translate what this thing said word for word?" And Zira nodded and placed her hands on the orb, and it glowed brighter and spoke again, this time in English. Subject: Zira, daughter of Telner class 3 failed candidate, has shown abnormal emotional bonding with native specimen, coded human alert level raised, potential breach in protocol directive 5. If subject remains unreturned, enforcer class drones will be dispatched to remove all traces of subject and incident. Countdown 7 rotations. End message. Jake clenched his fists and said, "So they do not just want you, they will burn the forest and kill anyone who saw you." And Zira nodded with tears in her eyes and said, "They believe that feelings make us weak, and I was already weak in their eyes, and now I am a virus to be erased." She stood and looked at the stars again and said, "I should run far from here, maybe into the cold places of this world where they cannot track me, and maybe you will be safe then." And Jake shook his head and said, "I will not let you face this alone, and if your people come, I will stand with you." Zira looked into his eyes, and for the first time she saw something strange there, not fear or pity, but something strong and warm, and it made her chest feel heavy and light at the same time, and she reached out to hold his hand and said, "You do not know what they are capable of." And he said, "I do not care, I only know what you are capable of, and that is more than what they say." The orb began to blink faster and then shot into the sky like a small comet, disappearing among the stars, and Zira said, "It is going to send one final report and then silence until they arrive, and now we must decide where to stand when they land." And Jake said, "We stand right here and we prepare." They went back inside the cabin, and Zira touched the wall and said, "I never imagined I would call any place home, but this place feels more like home than the great towers of my world ever did." And Jake said, "Then we protect it together." And Zira nodded, and her glowing mark shifted color from blue to gold, which meant her power was changing. With her heart in the sky high above the clouds, a silent ship moved into orbit, invisible to the world below, and inside it machines prepared for descent, while alien eyes watched the coordinates of a small cabin hidden in the woods, where a runaway girl and a stubborn human had chosen to fight instead of hide. The sky above the forest turned red as a strange, glowing ship pierced through the clouds and hovered over the Earth's surface. People in the town screamed and ran in panic, while others pointed their cameras toward the sky in disbelief. Jake stood outside his home, frozen, as he held Zira in his arms. Her small purple body trembled as she looked up and whispered that they had found her. She begged Jake to run and hide, but he shook his head and said he would never leave her inside the ship. A group of tall, armored aliens watched the scanner as it blinked and beeped, showing Zira's location. She had activated her forbidden's healing power, and that was all they needed to track her down. The leader of the alien hunters narrowed his eyes and commanded the crew to land near the signal. Zira's heart raced and her eyes filled with fear as she sensed The heavy footsteps nearing their door, Jake gently placed her on the table and told her to stay hidden no matter what happened. But Zira refused to let him face danger alone. The door exploded with a loud crash and the hunters stormed in with glowing weapons raised. Jake picked up an old metal rod and stood in front of Zira, ready to defend her even if it meant his life. The aliens scanned the room and saw her glowing faintly behind Jake. They shouted in their own language, ordering him to step aside. Jake refused and swung the rod at the nearest alien, who blocked it with a force shield and knocked Jake across the room. Zira screamed and her body lit up with a burst of blue energy that pushed the hunters back. She floated into the air as her arms extended and light poured from her palms. One of the hunters fired a stun blast that hit her in the shoulder, making her cry out in pain. Jake crawled toward her, bleeding from the head, and shouted for her to stay strong. Zira landed back on the floor, weak and shaking as her chest glowed and cracked. Her energy core was failing, and without it she would not survive. The hunters closed in again, ready to capture her, but Jake leapt between them with a roar. He managed to grab one of their weapons and fire it toward the ceiling, causing debris to fall and block the door. Smoke filled the room as Jake pulled Zira into his arms and crawled through the back exit. They emerged into the forest behind the house, running as fast as they could. Zira's breaths became short and shallow as her skin dimmed and her core flickered inside her chest. Jake carried her through the trees, desperate to find a place to hide behind them. The hunters chased them through the woods, shouting and blasting trees out of the way. Jake stumbled and fell down a small hill, landing hard on the ground with Zira cradled against his chest. He looked at her and tears filled his eyes as he saw the cracks spreading across her glowing core. Zira lifted her hand and touched his cheek, whispering that she was sorry. She said she never wanted him to be hurt because of her. Jake held her tight and told her that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. He looked around and saw an old shed nearby. With all his strength, he carried her there and placed her gently on a pile of cloth. He searched her small satchel and found a tiny toolkit with alien symbols. He remembered her showing him how her suit worked days ago. His hands trembled as he carefully opened the core panel on her chest and saw the complex web of lights and wires. Zira could barely speak, but guided him with weak words, telling him what to connect and what not to touch. The hunters were getting closer, and Jake could hear their heavy boots crunching leaves in the distance. He worked fast, following her instructions, trying to ignore his fear and the sweat running down his face. The core sparked and flickered, but still did not stabilize. Zira's eyes started to close, and Jake panicked, shouting her name and begging her to stay awake. He noticed a glowing crystal inside the toolkit and remembered her saying it was a backup charge. With shaking hands, he inserted the crystal into the slot and closed the panel. The core buzzed and then glowed brightly. Zira gasped as her body jerked and her eyes opened wide with surprise. Jake smiled and pulled her into his arms again as she slowly regained her strength. Outside the shed, the hunters stopped and scanned the area again, but this time the core's signal was hidden. Zira looked at Jake and whispered that he had saved her life again. He held her close and said he would do it 1,000 times more. The silence in the shed wrapped around them like a warm blanket as Zira rested in Jake's arms with her eyes barely open and her chest glowing gently with a repaired energy core. Jake sat against the wall, staring at the small alien girl whose life now pulsed because of a human hand. His heart still pounded from the chase and the danger, but in that moment all that mattered was that she was alive. Zira looked at him and whispered something so faint that he had to lean in to hear it. She said she had seen her life flash before her eyes, and in that vision, she saw only one place where she ever felt safe, and it was right there with him. Jake held her tighter and said she was safe now, that he would never let anyone hurt her again. Outside the shed, the forest remained still, but danger still loomed beyond the trees. Zira slowly sat up with Jake's help and looked down at the glowing lines running through her chest. She touched them softly and remembered her home planet, where punishment was pain and mercy was weakness. Her memories rushed back like waves as she closed her eyes and saw herself standing before the elders who sentenced her to Earth for disobedience and for showing kindness to a lower species. She had only tried to help a creature in need, but that simple act was called betrayal in her world. Now, sitting beside a human who risked his life for her, she realized how different Earth was from her home. Jake noticed tears slipping down her face and gently wiped them away with his thumb. He asked her what she was thinking, and she said she was thinking about the meaning of home. She said home was never a place but a feeling. And for the first time she understood what that meant. Jake smiled and told her she would always have a place beside him. Suddenly, a soft buzzing came from the corner of the shed, and Zira turned her head sharply, recognizing the sound. It was one of the communication devices from her suit trying to reconnect with the fleet. Zira walked slowly toward it and pressed her hand against the small panel. The screen flickered and then showed a familiar face, one that made her knees shake. It was the alien queen herself, speaking through the broadcast with a cold voice. She announced that Zira had violated more laws by using her powers and accepting human interference, and now the fleet would arrive to deliver the final judgment. Zira stared at the screen and then back at Jake, who stood up behind her, ready to fight again. Zira's fingers hovered over the reply button, but she hesitated. Jake asked what would happen if the fleet landed, and she said nothing would survive within 50 miles. He asked if there was a way to stop it, and she whispered there might be only one. Her voice trembled as she said she could surrender herself and hope the Queen would show mercy. Jake looked at her and said he did not save her just to lose her. Now Zira looked at him and reached up, placing her tiny hand against his chest where his heartbeat echoed beneath her palm. She said his heartbeat was the only sound she wanted to hear, and that gave her strength. She turned back to the device and pressed a button that sent a signal to the sky, a request for parley. The signal flew upward, and minutes later, the clouds above twisted and parted as a massive alien ship slowly descended toward the forest. Jake and Zira stepped outside the shed and watched as a platform lowered from the ship, and the Queen herself stepped out, tall and fierce, with her guards beside her. Zira walked forward without fear and stood before her ruler, who glared at her with eyes like ice. The Queen asked if Zira was ready to accept the punishment and return to face her fate. Zira looked up and said she was ready to accept the consequences, but not regret the choice she made. She said she found something more powerful than fear, more lasting than rules, and that was love and trust. Jake stepped forward beside her and said he was not afraid of the Queen or her army. He said Zira had saved his world more than once, and now it was time for his world to protect her. The Queen looked at them both and raised her hand, but instead of striking, she lowered it slowly and turned her gaze to the trees and sky. She said she had not expected this outcome, that maybe humans were not the monsters they had been told. She said perhaps punishment was not always the path to peace. The Queen turned to her guards and gave the command to stand down, and as her ship rose again into the sky, the forest fell quiet once more. Zira turned to Jake and smiled through tears and whispered that she had made her choice and Earth was her home now. The sky broke open with a blinding flash as a giant shadow fell over the forest, and animals ran in panic, while trees bent low from the force of the sudden storm. And Jake stood in front of the cabin holding a long metal rod like a weapon, and Zira stood beside him with her hands glowing gold and her eyes locked on the massive alien ship that now hovered above them. With silent rage, the ship pulsed with deep light as if breathing, and then a voice filled the air so loud and cold that the birds stopped singing and even the wind seemed afraid. And the voice called for Zira, daughter of Telnor, Class 3, to step forward and surrender to the will of the Council and return for judgment or face complete deletion. Zira took a deep breath and stepped ahead while Jake reached out, but she smiled at him softly and said, I must speak to them or nothing will change. And she raised both hands to the sky and called out in her own language, and the ship responded by sending down a beam of pure light from which stepped a tall, glowing figure with eyes like glass and no expression on its face. The figure walked forward slowly and looked at Zira with a stare that froze the air and said, You were sent here to learn your place, to correct your failure to be useful, but instead you have embraced weakness and have bonded with a primitive, and this proves that you are no longer fit to return and must be erased with the witness you corrupted. Jake stepped forward then with his jaw tight and his eyes blazing, and he said, I am not a primitive, and she is not a failure, and if you cannot see the strength in her, then maybe you are the ones who need to change. And the figure turned its head toward him slowly, as if examining an insect, and said, Humans are unstable, emotional, irrational, and dangerous to the order we protect, and this one has now become an extension of your Kalsira's hands lit brighter as she said, I am not a tool, and I am not broken, and I have seen more in this place than I ever saw in the Towers of Silence, and I have felt more in one moment here than in years of cold training, and if that makes me unworthy, then I do not wish to be worthy anymore." The alien figure raised its arm and the sky above cracked with lightning as drones appeared from hidden ports and hovered in perfect formation, and Jake moved in front of Zero ready to fight. Even without a chance, and Zero whispered something in her language, and her mark pulsed once more in a golden shield formed around them both like a cocoon of living light. The figure paused and looked at the shield, then said, "You have triggered the bond protocol, an ancient link formed only through true will and shared purpose. This was not expected and must be reviewed." And suddenly the light in the ship dimmed and more figures appeared on screens around the trees, all watching and listening as Zero stepped forward inside the shield and said, "I choose this world, and I choose my own path, and I choose this human not because I was told to, but because I feel alive when I am near him, and I do not fear that feeling anymore." Silence spread over the forest as even the ship stopped humming, and the figure lowered its arm and said, "The bond is complete and irreversible. This makes you no longer property of the Council, but an outlier, one who cannot be controlled or retrieved. Your status is now neutral. You may remain here, but you are never to return." Jake looked confused, but Zira turned to him and smiled with tears in her eyes and said, "They have released me not because they wanted to, but because they had to, and now I'm not one of them, and not only of here, but something new, and I think I like that." And Jake pulled her into his arms without a word, and the golden shield faded slowly into dust like sunlight breaking through the clouds. The ship slowly lifted back into the sky, and its lights faded, and the drones vanished, and the forest became still again, and the stars returned to their places like nothing had happened. And Jake and Zira stood in the clearing hand in hand, and she looked at him and said, "I'm no longer afraid, and I want to build something here, not a kingdom or a tower, but a life." And Jake nodded and said, "Then we start today." They walked back to the cabin as morning light began to rise, and Zira looked at the trees, the grass, the sky, and said, "This planet is strange and beautiful and full of loud colors and soft sounds, and it is messy and wild and sometimes scary, but it feels more like home than the palace where I was born." And Jake said, "Maybe that is what real home feels like." Above them the stars watched quietly, and somewhere in the vast space beyond a record of her choice was stored not as a failure, but as a first step toward something new, something unknown and beautiful. And Zira smiled as she closed the door behind them, ready for whatever came next.